as an introduction, so my name is Alex Frangi. I'm the executive director from the UK Centre of Excellence on In-Silico Regulatory Science and Innovation. And very briefly, for those of you who may hear this for the first time, the UK CEiRSI is one of the 7 centres of excellence in regulatory science and innovation funded by Innovate UK and MRC, and with support from the MHRA in the UK. This is a collaboration between a number of academic, regulatory, and industry organizations, both from the UK and abroad, that we have as a main objective to accelerate the awareness and adoption of in-silico technologies as one of a complementary tool for producing regulatory evidence alongside bench, animal, and human testing. And today, I'm delighted to introduce an additional webinar that we are doing. This is part of our initial phase to raise awareness and also provide training material for the wider community. And I'm going to hand over the word to Stephen Kreuzer, who is going to introduce this webinar, and welcome all of you. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, everybody, for coming. Definitely appreciate the attendance here. Appreciate you joining us. It should be a good conversation. Our focus today is going to be asking regulatory experts, the 2 folks that you see on the screen here with me, some specific questions associated with computational modeling simulation, in silico trials, how to think about those 2 activities with respect to regulatory questions. Some general comments about regulatory strategy and how some of these pieces are put together. My goal in organizing this and in coming up with some of these questions was really focused on, as more of a technical operator, what sort of things should we have in mind as we approach and interact with folks from a clinical/regulatory background. These questions are going to be more focused on the regulatory side of things, but obviously the clinical side comes in as well, so we'll touch on those aspects as we go through this. Some big, some housekeeping type notes. Please feel free to put questions in the Q&A box, in the chat, what have you. We will, I'm sure, come back to those at the end if we have time, which I'm sure we will. We've got a good list of questions here, but we'll want to make sure we leave time for whatever you guys have in mind. So please do feel free to drop those in. By way of introduction, so as Alex mentioned, Steve Kreuzer, with a company called Exponent. We do technical consulting, scientific engineering type stuff. We do quite a bit of analysis and so forth, and I've been involved in silico trials and modeling and simulation for a long time here. We've done a couple of other webinars prior to this one. As Alex mentioned, this is part of a series, so do pay attention to the YouTube channel and the other links that you have to look back on some of those other pieces of content associated with the CEiRSI. This one will as well be recorded and shared, so feel free to share with your colleagues, friends, acquaintances, family, whoever, if you have anything that you want to come back and look at or talk about. As it relates to introductions, we have with us today 2 excellent panelists, 2 folks who really know what they're talking about from a regulatory perspective. The first one I'll introduce is Dr. René Bombien. He's a clinical director at qtec, and qtec is a company, their area of focus is regulatory affairs, quality management, clinical affairs, design control, those sorts of things. One of their taglines is they take care of your medical devices. So they're a group that focuses there. And René's background started as a cardiac surgeon. So he had done that, I believe, for around a decade or so. And then he was at TUV for almost a dozen years, so 11.5 years, before moving over to qtec in the fall. And after I introduce Bethany, René, I'll give you an opportunity to add anything you might like to that introduction. And Dr. Bethany Chung is with us as well. She's a senior manager at RQM+. Her focus is on clinical post-market space, benefit risk analysis, things of that nature. Their tagline, RQM+, is they don't make med tech, they make med tech happen. So another group that provides some really key assistance to companies that are going through this regulatory process. One of the benefits, I think, of talking to folks with this background, Bethany and René, is that they've seen a lot of different scenarios. They've been with their organizations, and they've worked with different organizations in supporting their regulatory questions. So I always like to think about there's a benefit of being very deep within an individual company making a product, but there's also a benefit for the folks like we have here who have seen a lot of different scenarios and a lot of different projects. So really look forward to having this conversation. Bethany was an AI/ML consultant before ChatGPT kicked off and the AI stuff really went crazy. So that was back in 2019. She was doing that for a little bit. So kudos to her for being out on the front end of some of these topics. And she as well did some clinical research at NIH focusing on speech, voice, swallowing activities, and intramuscular stimulation. So before we get into the questions, René, I'll ask you if you have anything to add, and then Bethany, if you want to add anything on that, and then we'll jump in.
Steve, thank you very much. I think I could have done it better. So thank you so much. I don't have anything to add. Thank you.
Oh, okay, great. Bethany, anything you'd like to share as well?
Yeah, I
Context?
just want to talk a little bit about a little more about what a nerd I am. So back in my academic days, my background is in math primarily. So anything math modeling, I kind of latch onto. So when Steve and I connected last year, it's like been nerding out to the max, and I've loved every minute of it. So I want to be as big of an advocate of this computer modeling and simulation and silico clinical trials as much as I can.
Awesome. And I really appreciate that, Bethany, and I have always enjoyed our conversations because of that perspective. I do feel, it's very valuable to have advocates in an objective sense, people who recognize the value of performing modeling and simulation work, but who have also seen things outside of just modeling and simulation. One of the big things that I love about the CEiRSI project in general and some of the activities going on in the community is that it brings together the technical folks with the regulatory folks, with the regulatory agencies, all sorts of people talking together. We were just on a pilot meeting talking about one of the pilot projects associated with the CEiRSI. And that conversation was discussing registry data, what was available there, what was available immediately after an operation, what was available, what we could do with the simulation to predict, all these sorts of things. And so, Bethany, your experience guiding companies through medtech, submission processes, regulatory strategy, et cetera, as well as your history and advocacy for modeling and simulation. And René, your interest and your experience in notified bodies really, I think, sets us up to have what should be a great conversation here. So without further ado, I'm sure everybody's sick of hearing me talk, so we'll have René and Bethany talk here. Starting with these general questions, we're going to do a few different categories of questions. As I mentioned, do put any questions that you guys have into the chat box. But general questions, we'll start with this one. So for you, Bethany, how can simulation practitioners advocate for including modeling and simulation in regulatory packages? I think the context for this one is that oftentimes we believe very strongly from the technical side that we have things to contribute to regulatory questions, regulatory submissions. But there is this tendency to not include things for various reasons, and I'm sure there's a lot of explanation there. But from your perspective, how can we as practitioners think about advocating for including the evidence that we feel strongly in these packages?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think it starts with exactly what we're doing right now. So it starts with education. There's a lot of computer modeling and simulation out there, models out there, methodologies out there that the regulators or regulatory affairs specialists just don't know about. So I think, first we have to start with the basics. People know bench testing, people know animal testing, people know clinical testing. But people don't always know in-silico testing or CM&S testing. Even though, I did do a little scan through some of FDA's special controls guidance documents. There are a couple of IVD special controls out there that do call for in-silico methods, but they're not widespread. And they're not widely known among regulatory professionals. So I think we need to start with education. We need to understand the benefits and risks of computer modeling, where they can fit into your regulatory submission. And once we've kind of established that, once we've gotten people on board to how it can be used, we really need to show examples. So it's a nice idea in theory, but until you see people using it and until you see the FDA or EU notified bodies accepting it, people are going to be really hesitant to kind of dive in and do something new.
Absolutely. That makes a lot of sense. René, do you have anything to add on that? I do have some follow-up question on that one, but let's see what your thoughts on how we can advocate for including modeling and simulation in appropriate context, of course, within regulatory packages.
I think Bethany already said most of the most important things there. However, I think that computational modeling and simulation is around for a long time already. I mean, like if you go to you know, all the basic science, whatever you do, I mean, there's a lot of modeling already since decades going on. And I think also people who have actually developed, in this case, also medical devices, were involved in developing clinical studies, they have seen already simulations. So I think it is already there. So and also like in maybe more rudimentary in the past, what we have today. But I think this is one of the things I think we just need to encourage also the people putting it into the submissions and also in the correct context. And I think this is also one of the things where we also will discuss here and also elaborate on, so that you need to have the correct content or the correct context in where you actually add your CM&S into the regulatory submission.
Yeah, I like that. And I want to circle back real quick to something that Bethany said, in particular, seeing examples and seeing case studies and hearing about regulatory agencies, notified bodies accepting the computational modeling and simulation evidence. One of the things I'm wondering is, how can we learn who is using modeling and simulation and the circumstances and the benefits of it? I'm wondering from your perspective and just sources of information, how can that be publicized, or how can people understand when it's being used or not used? Are there sort of any key tells in summaries of safety and efficacy information or clinical trial protocols or other sources of public information, short of somebody coming out and talking about it in a presentation, which they may choose to do, and some groups have done that? And maybe the answer is no, there's really no way to tell what's being done behind the curtain, but just wondering, and I want to put this out there, are there any places that we can go to understand more about applications that are being used, and where it's showing up in regulatory submissions?
Bethany, would you like to go first?
Sure. So I think you hit the nail on the head there, Steve, where the FDA, you know, publishes summaries of submissions, 510(k) submissions, PMA submissions, de novo to some extent. Once the decision is made, the reclassification is made, they do make public the type of studies that were done to some extent. You're not going to get all the details on it.
Right.
Unfortunately, outside of the FDA, it's a little bit of a black box, especially without UTMED and the EU. There's not a whole lot of publicly available information out there. I don't know, René, if you have a different idea about that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's not like publicly information like in a way that it is kind of combined, or what you said. I mean, Steve, you know, seeing in a webinar somebody talking about it, I think this is something that you won't find. But I mean, there are some initiatives, I mean, and then also like some institutes where you can actually go and find people working on basic science, but also with companies. I mean, like, I think this is what you have to do. So you have to actually go into the network or tap into the network and then try to get the information there. I mean, I think with UK CEiRSI, I mean, this is something that actually, I mean, this is pathing the way of having this more in a condensed way, so that also manufacturers can go, where also the regulatory bodies can go and say, okay, here's something where we can actually get information on. So, but yeah, I think most importantly is that you actually create your network where you can get the information from.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. I appreciate that. And if anything, that's advertisement or a prompt or a pitch or what have you for all of the folks within this call who are interested in, who are advocates for modeling and simulation, to try to go out and talk as much as possible about these topics. I do think there are some groups that do that quite a bit. There's some teams from Medtronic, some teams from Zimmer who I know who have gone out and published publicly, and there's others as well, certainly. Those are two that come to mind, who have gone out and talked about these things, that they're doing it. Whether or not they've gotten results and what the responses have been from regulatory officials, that might be, to your point, René, it may just be conversations and talking about those things. And it may be, you just leveraging whatever network you have and the folks that you know, building that network to try to grow your ability to understand what's going on within the market. That certainly makes a lot of sense.
And
Fantastic.
I have just to add a little
please.
bit to that,
Yeah.
I have noticed that, RAPS in particular, the Regulatory Affairs Professional Society, a lot of their content, a lot of their conversation, a lot of their conferences in the last year or so have been AI centered.
Yeah.
And I think there has, as part of that, there is a little offshoot where people are talking more and more about in silico clinical trials.
Yeah.
So, figuring out who these people are who are talking about it and just asking lots and lots of questions.
Yeah.
I think that's the best way of doing it right now. I'm finding it's exploding a little bit more in the drug space right now than it is in the device space. But, keep asking questions, trying to find parallels, that kind of thing.
No, I appreciate that point. And on that note, RAPS is a good organization to follow for those who are from the technical side of things. That's a good place to get information to go and to learn more about what's happening. Understanding just what are the key conferences that people go to and organizations that people are involved with is really important. So, I think RAPS is a great example there as well. And I do think, and I didn't put this on the list of questions that I sent to you guys, but we'll come back to AI because, we in this group are talking a lot more about first principles, computational modeling, simulation type approaches. But I do think obviously AI is very important, and that was an oversight on my question list. So we'll come back to that. All right, René, I'm going to come to you with the next question. This question is around demonstrating capabilities to a regulatory affairs team. So if you're sitting from the perspective of trying to establish a package and understand what information is going to go into a submission, and a group who's done some modeling, hopefully they've been talking to you throughout the process, but what are some ways that the technical team can demonstrate to you that the work has been done in a way that's credible, that has an appropriate level of evidence behind it, that is incorporating an appropriate level of risk? Really want to think about this question from the context of internally or, as a consultant working within a group, but within the context of trying to develop evidence for a package for a particular device. What are some ways that those technical folks can help to demonstrate the good work that they've done? What are some key things that you would look at for as a regulatory affairs professional and from that lens in order to assess the work that they've done?
I think that's a good and important question because, it is still quite new in regulatory submissions. I think this is also why many companies are hesitant actually to include this, right? Or many of the regulatory affairs teams are actually reluctant or hesitant to include this into the submission. I think one thing is important looking at the MDR. MDR Annex 7 4.5.4 actually allows manufacturers to submit computational simulated data. So that means the notified body must have the capability of doing the review. This is what is written in the regulatory framework in the EU. And I think that is the first thing that actually the regulatory affairs team should acknowledge. So first of all, if the technical team at a company comes with all the data, I think it is absolutely important to speak the same language. And I think this is also one of the gaps that I always see, that even within companies, there's not the same language being spoken, right? Regulatory affairs specialists, they have the regulatory body in their mind, the technicians, they have the science in mind, but I think the gap is important to bridge. So that means if regulatory affairs teams is aware that actually, okay, we can submit computational data to the notified body to be reviewed, I think it's important, to understand where this is placed. So what is actually this computational modeling adding on information that we don't have or that we didn't have before? And actually, is the notified body also capable of reviewing this?
Yeah.
But they have to be, they should be capable of reviewing it. So I think this is something that has to be bridged in between companies. If there is some translator necessary actually to bridge that gap, I think this is also helpful at some points. A good way is actually, as you said before, as Bethany also said, going to conferences, seeing different type of people being together in one room. Having the scientists, having the regulatory affairs people, and seeing also the same or similar language that they can use actually to explain. And I think looking at, there's some good UK EU initiatives from, for example, Avijana Alliance, from the Virtual Physiological Institute, for example. This is also helpful. For example, they have some very nice explanations also on webinars or videos. That also regulatory affairs people actually can see, and also to understand what is behind CM&S and also in regulatory submissions.
Yeah, great. Love it. Bethany, anything to add on that one?
Just, if you think you're approaching someone who would not be as receptive to these methods, maybe start small. So, find one step in the process where you can bring CM&S in, and say, like, look, this is a very small step. It's pretty straightforward. It's easy to validate. And that'll kind of warm people up to the idea.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And René, we're gonna come back to this question on notified bodies in a second here. I want to ask Bethany another question first, though. And this is a broader question, actually. We have a lot of people on this call and associated with the CEiRSI, and obviously everybody who's working in this field needs to be aware of and needs to handle, quite frankly, the different regulatory agencies across the globe. They all have their different processes and procedures. We've already talked about or alluded to specific differences between the different, at least the FDA and the EU and the UK previously. But Bethany, I was curious on that point. And speaking obviously very generally, and if you have specific examples, that'd be great. But what are some of the key differences in regulatory posture between these different organizations, between the FDA, between the EU notified bodies, between organizations in the UK? Are there any sort of posture difference? Obviously, the procedures are different, but is there anything that we might think about that might help us to understand how these different organizations are going to look at different pieces of evidence?
Yeah. And I think to get at that, I'm going to start with the basics. So bear with me for a couple of minutes.
No, that's great. Yeah, this is perfect.
Going to go somewhere.
Okay. No, that's great.
So I'm going to focus on the US and the EU. And the reason I'm doing that is those are the primary markets that people are going to. And there's a lot of back and forth where if you get on market in the EU, there's a lot to that submission that you can use to get on market in other geographies like the UK, like Australia. So I'm going to focus on those two and kind of the differences between them.
Perfect.
So with the US, we have one regulatory body. We have the FDA. So with the idea of one regulatory body, it kind of buys you a little bit of confidence that there's going to be some consistency across reviews, across submissions. This is in theory. I know there are a lot of examples of inconsistencies, but I think in general, we do see some sort of consistency. On the EU side, though, we have your reviewer is directly associated with a notified body. Notified bodies are private entities, and each notified body is certified by a competent authority. So the competent authority is essentially the government for each member state or each country in the EU. So there are a couple of different levels of oversight, but each competent authority in and of itself can have different opinions, different interpretations of the guidances, different interpretations of the regulation. So there is a little more underlying inconsistency there. And maybe René will disagree with me on that, but
No, not at all. I think you made this, I think, perfectly clear that there's a lot of people involved.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe one thing that how I came to CM&S, that was actually sitting in a panel together with Brent Craven from FDA. You know, that was one of the EU Horizon projects. And I mean, he's actually, or he is the head of the department for computational modeling and simulation. So I mean, the FDA does have a department doing this. I mean, there's no regulatory body in the EU doing studies on computational modeling and simulations. Also, they also published last year in May this great paper here, ACOG and colleagues. So I mean, this is what we don't have in the EU, unfortunately. So, and FDA in US, the people who review the submissions, they're actually being part of defining what to review. But I mean, we don't have this in the EU, unfortunately, yet.
Yeah. And then, along with that, since the FDA is the decision maker and they are a public organization, they're part of the government, they have a lot more leniency than the notified bodies do when it comes to having open conversations and strategic conversations with manufacturers. With notified bodies, since they're private entities, there is an effort to avoid any conflict of interest in terms of, we want to go with TÜV, for example, because they're really easy to get through. So TÜV gets more business if they allow more devices to go through a positive review. So in order to kind of reduce that level of bias and conflict of interest, the notified bodies are not allowed to consult with manufacturers in terms of regulatory strategy and what is needed to go through a favorable review. So I think there is some strategy with people now going to FDA first and kind of having those pre-sub meetings, those Q-sub meetings. So these are pre-submission meetings where you can go in and, propose a strategy to the FDA and they can poke holes in it and they can give you their opinion of what needs to be done. So you can understand their appetite for CM&S there. Whereas if you bring it to the notified body, they have introduced structured dialogue now, but strategy, especially clinical strategy, is something that they are still forbidden to discuss in these structured dialogue meetings.
Are there any other bodies that can provide feedback? Anything that maybe sits outside of the confines of an individual notified body? Are there sort of industry-wide groups, or can the individual competent authorities convene a review body of some kind?
So for higher risk devices and for novel devices, there's the expert panels, and they can give opinions. So there is some allowances within MDR to seek out an expert panel opinion, and this is primarily for your for your clinical strategy.
Okay.
Your clinical study planning, that type of thing.
Got it.
I'm not exactly sure what timelines look like for that right now, but that is an option for those higher risk devices.
Interesting.
In my experience, though, manufacturers of higher risk devices tend to have a really robust strategy going into it. It's these lower risk devices, these devices that have been on the market under the old MDD, the Medical Device Directive, who now need to remediate to MDR and don't realize that they need more clinical evidence. And they're running into this problem now, and they need clinical evidence quickly, and they need, extra validation to bring up to the most recent standards fairly quickly. I think they're the ones who can benefit most from CM&S, and they don't have the luxury of going to expert panels.
Sure. Yeah, got it. That makes sense. Interesting. René, I got a question that's going to piggyback off of this, but before I get there, I'm curious if you have anything to add on to Bethany's answer with respect to the previous question and regulatory posture / differences between organizations.
I think Yeah, I think the biggest challenge is actually that the notified body is not allowed to consult
Yeah.
in any way. And I think, I mean, this is it is just the way it is. And I think there's also something that needs to be respected in a way. I mean, you know, some people are very upset about this, but I mean, it doesn't help. I mean, this is the structure in Europe that we have to work with the MDCG 2022-14 that Bethany mentioned with the structured dialogue. I think this is really a good opportunity to discuss. Up to my knowledge, I mean, I don't want to say too much or something wrong. Basically, things. I mean, it is always good to have an idea what do you want to discuss with your notified body, maybe also share this in advance. I mean, not saying is 10 patients enough, or I mean, not discussing the numbers, because this is going to lead to nowhere. And I think this is also understandable. But I think if you are discussing strategy, I mean, also, I mean, not only classification strategy, maybe also like in whatever you would like to know. I think this is something always good to have this in advance of these structured dialogues, so that the notified body can also be prepared to this question, and then also decide, you know, whether to say, yeah, this is something that is in line with the regulation, or it is not in line with the regulation.
Right? Sure. Yeah. Interesting. So on the topic of notified bodies, and getting to our next question here, and you alluded to this earlier, René, because you had mentioned that the notified bodies should have the ability to review modeling and simulation evidence because it's part of their certification. So they should be able to do that. But what I'm curious about are what are the main challenges that notified bodies have in reviewing computational modeling and simulation evidence? Given that's a newer evidence category, what does that look like internally within these organizations that you can share, of course, with respect to the review? Because you gave the example of Brent at the FDA, and you know how he does this on a regular basis, and they have a whole team of people, and they're publishing and whatnot. I'm not aware of, and that might be my ignorance certainly, but I'm not aware of anybody from notified bodies being part of simulation working groups and publishing and things of that nature. So I'm wondering what the challenges might be within notified bodies. And then following up on that, are there any sort of ways that technical professionals, folks who are doing the analysis, people who are packaging the results and discussing that we can really, I guess, accommodate whatever the challenges might be and avoid overwhelming reviewers with just a massive amount of evidence or information, because certainly modeling results can be robust, and they should be. So I'm wondering, sort of, what are the challenges that you're aware of and able to talk about with respect to reviewing this evidence within notified bodies? And then what might be some strategies that we can have to package results in a way that makes them digestible, if you will, for notified bodies?
I think, yeah, I mean, this is a twofold question, right? I mean, the first thing with regard to if there's competence in notified bodies reviewing this, I mean, actually, it is amazing how much great people you have in notified bodies doing the reviews. I mean, usually, I mean, I've been working for TÜV, I mean, before I started qtec for 11.5 years, and I was also part in training programs. And I mean, you don't see people there with no experience. Usually you see there people that have a lot of experience. And there is also a lot of people actually having experience also in the area of computational modeling and simulation, right? Because this is part of what also companies are doing.
Right.
So there is the evidence, or there are people that actually can look at the evidence. But I think the biggest issue that notified bodies do have is the time, and also manufacturers. I mean, not only notified bodies, but also the manufacturers. So you have, if you submit for conformity assessment, you have a certain time span that you would like to be in, because, you know, there's the pressure for marketing. You know, you have to have the certificate at a certain point to get the device on the market. So if it is not clear on how the evidence is going to look like for computational modeling and simulation, it might also be difficult to put this into a calculation of time. So, you know, if a notified body says, yeah, we're accepting this, and then evidence comes in, and it might be, as you said, that much and overwhelming, they will actually plus the time span that you actually have calculated for. I mean, this is a risk, and there's a risk on both sides, right? So if you're expecting as a manufacturer at a certain point to get your certificate, but I mean, maybe it is based on the amount of data that has not been packaged in nice pieces. I mean, this can be a real problem for your submission. And I think this is something coming back to the structured dialogue before what we said before. I mean, this is something that could be discussed, right? I mean, are there people that are capable of looking into modeling and simulation? We do have, I don't know, finite element testing, and we would like to submit this and this. So I mean, this is something that where also notified body could say, okay, this is something that we could plan for, right?
Yeah.
So, and I think there is always the possibility for dialogue. So I think biggest issue, I think, is the time. If you can't estimate what is actually coming. Second might be maybe the lack of people who can look at it, but I think this might not be the
Yeah, it sounds like that's not a
I
challenge.
think that should not be the biggest issue.
Mm-hmm.
And I think another one is if you do verification and validation of the data that has been submitted, it has to be in a transparent way.
Yeah.
Most of the time, what I have learned talking to scientists, talking to people, they say, okay, you know, somewhere down the line, they decided, okay, we could go with this simulation data and submit this for the regulatory submission, but then they're missing a part of it. So they have to do like a kind of retrograde engineering actually to get back with their model to say, okay,
yeah,
this is where we started, and these are all the steps we have to take. So they have not started at one point and have planned every step along the down the road.
Yeah.
And I think this might be something where this transparency might also be lost. If this
Yeah, no, René, I really like those thoughts. I want to follow back on in a second, but Bethany, anything to add on that based on your interactions?
I think you make a good point with the structured dialogue where, you know, even if you cannot get, you know, yeah, this is great, or no, definitely don't do that from the notified body, you can present, you know, your plans and ask if they have any concerns with it. And at that point, you know, they can say yes or no. They don't need to elaborate, but, you know, at least if you're going down the right direction. And in terms of transparency, I think that's the most important piece that needs to be communicated between your regulatory affairs department and your technical team. Documentation is the most important part of regulatory submission. So it's something that, you know, as a technical developer is maybe not at the forefront of your mind because you're just, you know, trial and error a lot of the time, right? I've been there.
No.
You do a bunch of stuff till it works, but documenting is key. Yeah, you want to document every piece of it.
Those are it's really helpful advice, I think, for the community just to understand the clarity, the importance of clarity, the importance of documentation, transparency in both how it seems, both in how you write up the analysis results as well as what you're referencing back to from a credibility perspective, the evidence that you have to support that. I do have, and I wanted to this, I think, an appropriate time to bring this in on this question. With respect to this timeline piece, which, René, I appreciate you bringing that up because it's a very important point. You know, one of the things we've seen is, or at least encountered in various circumstances, whether it's been published or not, but conversations around the value of presenting peer-reviewed papers or putting together peer-reviewed papers with methods and results and just sort of background information that can help to sort of pave the way for submissions. Curious to your thoughts. I'll start with René and Bethany if you have anything to add here. Curious with your thoughts as the value of if you're going into an analysis or a scenario where you need analysis, taking the methods, taking some of the evidence you want to compare to, sort of building that credibility piece in peer-reviewed literature, getting it out there first before you go through the submission process. Is that a pathway or a mechanism that can help in the review process, that can help with respect to the timeline piece that you mentioned for notified bodies?
I think, I mean, you mean publishing the methods or publishing the data? Because
Publishing the methods, let's assume the data, there's pieces of the data that you don't necessarily want to share, but you might publish sort of the framework on how you're doing the modeling. Maybe you have a different way of doing it, or there's like tweak or something along those lines.
right, I think that might be helpful. What definitely helps, I mean, if you say, you know, you are modeling on the basis of peer-reviewed documents.
Yeah.
So I mean,
Yeah.
also looking back into the experience I have with clinical trials, I mean, if somebody who sent in data for a clinical trial and they are based on, or the methodology is based on a peer or on several peer-reviewed analyses, I mean, this makes it easier to follow and understand, and also to say, okay, yeah, I mean, this is credible what we are seeing here.
Yeah, yeah, no, I appreciate that point. Bethany, any thoughts on that question?
Yeah, I think the key is that the methodologies that you use, the comparisons that you make, the regulators are always asking for scientific justification behind the choices that you make. And if you have a published peer-reviewed article, that's a really good place to go and point to and say, look, it is based on science now. The scientific community agrees on it. It's justifiable at that point.
Yeah, I like it. All right, so what we're expecting then, based on, you know, this conversation, all those folks in the audience, get out there, write your papers. You know, let's get some more of this in the public space. We talked about this with respect to case studies and examples as well, but should be talking about this as much as possible. And you know, I think there's obviously benefits to that as we discussed here. All right, so we talked very generally about regulatory agencies, processes, some differences between things. I do want to change topics a little bit, although obviously still on the regulatory front, to discuss a bit more on regulatory strategy. What I think is really what I'm hoping to get out of this portion of the conversation is some context around how decisions are made from a program perspective. So oftentimes from modeling standpoint, you know, folks who are involved in the modeling might have a specific question they're trying to address, and they may be tasked with answering that question. They might have some sort of area that they're focusing on, but you know, they may or may not have a good context for how that fits in with everything else that's going on. What I'd like to understand through this series of questions is how a regulatory package and how the strategy comes together, what the different pieces are, how one should think about positioning the modeling and think about it in the context of the other pieces of evidence, preclinical evidence, animal testing, to the extent that it's there, all those pieces. So I'm going to go to Bethany first with this question, but big picture, what is the timeline for deciding on regulatory strategy? Now, there's obviously the total product life cycle, and there's different concepts associated with that. But I'm wondering specifically, what are the best times to explore including modeling and simulation strategies for eventual use in regulatory submissions? When should these topics be brought to the regulatory group? I mean, hopefully there's dialogue throughout and everybody is on the same page, but when should concepts and things be really brought to the fore so that they can be decided? What's the most advantageous time for that? And really, when is it too late, quite frankly, to bring modeling and simulation evidence with respect to the workflow that's been established up to that point?
Yeah, when we think about regulatory strategy, the true driving factor of it in most cases is the intended purpose of your device. So once you have that intended purpose set, and this is, you know, brings in the intended use. So what is it doing? It brings in the indications. What medical condition is it treating? The target patient population. Are we looking at adults? Are we looking at the elderly? Are we looking at children? Are we looking at pregnant patients? It brings in the clinical environment. So is this device being used in the clinic? Is it being used at home? Is it being used by a healthcare professional or by a layperson? Once you have that in place, that drives the objective to gathering all of your data. So it drives all of the questions you're trying to answer and the regulators are trying to answer about your device. It's driving the endpoints that you want to see. It's driving the type of studies that you want to do. It's driving the classification, the risk classification of your device. And with that, in the US, it may drive, what your predicate device is if you are going down a 510K pathway. And so that's the point where you want to say, okay, what has my predicate device submitted? And that's publicly available online. Is this something I can achieve with modeling and simulation? Can I compare myself to my predicate device using modeling and simulation? So that's kind of the pathway that I think about, at least on the US side. On the EU side, it's fairly similar, right? Once you understand what questions you need to answer, that's when you need to start planning what type of validation studies that you're using. Once you've kind of gone down that path, if you have done bench testing and you realize you're not getting the data that you want to be getting, maybe I should try modeling and simulation. That's maybe not the right time to do it.
Yeah.
I want to think about it earlier than that.
Yeah. So it sounds like then you basically, you got to get the indications for use. You got to get all the sort of big picture questions answered. And then as a regulatory team, you're doing a couple of things. You're trying to identify, okay, what are the risks perhaps of this device? How can we demonstrate that those risks are, whatever level they happen to be, or we believe that they are? How do we assess those risks through different pieces of evidence? And so the regulatory strategy perspective would be to decide on, okay, we have risks A, B, C, here's maybe what predicate devices have done. Here's what we think we can do to address those risks. But that's all done, sounds like, very early in the process in terms of going out in creating your strategy for the types of evidence and testing and things that you're going to need to do. Does that sound about right?
It is. Yeah. And when we're talking risks, we're not just talking necessarily like the harms to the patient, the safety risks. We're talking, is this device doing what we say it's going to do? Is it actually going to be providing a benefit? What can happen so that it doesn't do what it's supposed to do? All of those risks built in as well. Yeah.
That makes sense. And one of the other risks that I like to think about from this context as well is risks of various tests passing or failing, right? Because, it's one of the use cases that I think is beneficial from an internal perspective of modeling and simulation, is really trying to assess whether your test is going to pass or not. And ideally, you've done some level of analysis and you have some good ideas to whether that's going to happen. But some of these tests can be really long. You might be running a 6-month test, you might be running a 9-month, 10-month, 12-month, whatever test. And so any information that you can have from a business risk perspective about whether your timelines are slipping, or what the probability of passing those tests is, can also, that's not a regulatory risk from the traditional approval perspective, but it is from the business perspective, which is an important thing to keep in mind. René, any thoughts on that in terms of timeline for deciding on strategy with respect to including modeling and simulation, maybe from the perspective of bringing in any piece really?
I think what Bethany already said, I think that is main points how to plan. I mean, the question that we had, when is it too late? I think this is also important to consider. However, I think it is not really something that might be too late. So I think if we talk about in-silico clinical trials, I think the beauty here is that we cannot actually be too late. So I think there's a certain amount of freedom that can be granted to do, because if you have your real study population already selected, there's no way of changing this. This is then a done deal, and this also has to be gone through. But I think if you have an ISCT and you have some specific points that you would like to elaborate, this can be done basically, I think at multiple times, not only at a certain point.
Yeah, it could be a post-market thing, right? One of the things that we were talking, right?
Exactly.
Yeah, can you elaborate on that? Yeah.
Right, and specifically, if you look into permanent implants, one of the things, that you can't, that you might not be able to predict is 6 months data is usually not enough. So if you go for regulatory submissions, 6 months data might not be enough. So, but what can you do, or what actually would you like to see? I mean, what would you like to see down the road? I mean, you know everything about post-op complications, bleeding, infection, but I mean, you want to know what is beyond that. I mean, an example for heart valves, for example, talking about calcification of biological heart valves. I mean, what can you do? Are there specific patient populations with high cholesterol in their blood? I mean, are they more prone to have their biological prostheses calcified earlier? So, I mean, this is something that you can't do in a regular study. You don't want to wait for, I don't know, 8 years or 10 years before you can publish your results. I mean, this is something where in-silico clinical trials really can come in and support also in specifically these detailed questions.
Yeah.
So these are populations that you will not be able to collect in real life, or also orphan device.
Well, yeah, bingo. I was going to go there next, René, with this
sorry.
question we have. And I think you hit the nail on the head in terms of scenarios, and orphan devices is when you and I obviously have talked about this before, but with respect to orphan devices, as an example of a scenario where it's more or less low-hanging fruit for an ISCT, certainly not easy by any means, but there are structural reasons why looking at orphan devices could be beneficial from an ISCT perspective. I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit about the orphan device piece, but then elaborate with respect to your other comments in terms of other clinical scenarios where you can see ISCTs having specific targeted value, perhaps because the clinical piece is so difficult to put together in the physical, real world.
Yeah, I think low-hanging fruit would be great, but I think there's actually we don't have this actually, also not this luxury for not for orphan devices, because I think one of the biggest issues that we still have, that the MDR does not allow to completely substitute human clinical trials with in-silico clinical trials. So there's actually not, I mean, it is not very clear in the regulatory framework. However, I think it always depends on, and specifically here in that case, in orphan device, it depends on how the evidence is being put together, right? For orphan devices, as we see last year in October, the MDCG published this guidance on orphan devices that actually allows for these so-called non-clinical data, that computational modeling and simulation is part of this, or can be used as clinical evidence, actually. But it is important that the definition is clear. So, and that the circumstances are also described appropriately, not, that nobody thinks, okay, we are just going behind the regulatory framework, so that we say, okay, this is actually the fact that we have. We will not be able to put together enough patients for this specific indication. So we are going to subsidize this with the in-silico clinical trial data.
Yeah.
But this will not only be for orphan devices. I mean, it doesn't matter at what devices you look at. I mean, if it's going to be endovascular treatments for aortic dissections, for example, or also orthopedic devices. I mean, all types of devices where you also have to have a broad range of sizes. It is not possible to set up a clinical trial where you actually have sufficient clinical data for each subgroup of device. So for the smallest one, for the largest one, that might not be possible. So this is also something that could be used, I mean, for in-silico clinical trials, actually to bring more light into these borderline groups also of devices already on the market.
Yeah. I like that point about devices already on the market. I mean, one of the things that I've always heard from people is just the perceived value, and I think it's real, but the value of including or looking at rare populations, scenarios where, and it might not be like a rare disease, for instance, it might not be in that scenario, but really more like the edge cases of a population set where you might, from a clinical standpoint, it might be very, very difficult to enroll a trial or to include that population in an analysis. However, you of course have a benefit if you have clinical evidence from the bulk of a population that doesn't necessarily have the edge case anatomies or physiology or what have you, that you can use to validate the approaches. And then it's a slight extrapolation. It certainly would be an extrapolation, but it's not an extreme, out of the blue extrapolation to get to some populations that might be just on the edge or just over the border of what you have in your clinical scenario. So I really like that point.
Absolutely. And I think if I may add one point to this, if this is okay. If you look at these, I mean, you said borderline, right? These borderline populations. Basically, even for regular clinical trials, there's not enough patients. I mean, like everybody needs to do clinical trials, but there is no patients anymore. So, I mean, if you have to reach a certain amount of numbers for human individuals in a trial, you will not be able to reach this number. So, because you can't enroll one patient in multiple trials. I mean, this is something that's basically not allowed that easily. So, and I think and you have high dropout rates. I mean, if you're looking into very vulnerable patient populations, you have high dropout rates that you can't compensate for. So I think there is, as you said earlier, I think, let's call it low-hanging fruit. I think there is some accessible areas that should be explored for this.
Yeah, no, I like that. Bethany, any other fruit ideas?
Yeah, if I could bring it back to the orphan devices.
Love it.
And,
Yeah, let's do it.
you know, we're talking edge cases, we're talking enhancing patient populations. What the MDCG guidance does allow for in some cases is extrapolation of clinical data from other populations or from other devices that are pretty close to the orphan device, or maybe a different population that's not quite orphan but uses the same device. One example that I came across recently was a breast biopsy marker that was indicated for adults and it was indicated for adolescents. Of course, no one's got adolescent data on it because it's used so rarely. So that is an orphan indication, even though we have a ton of data on adults using it. When we extrapolate that adult data, you know, if that is sufficient enough to kind of get us across the line in terms of getting your CE mark, maybe we can just enhance that with some in silico testing, right? So that is a low-hanging fruit in my mind, where if we have our preclinical testing and we have this clinical data that we can extrapolate, adding in silico testing to that is doing nothing but enhancing your data set for something that's, you know,
otherwise
the
very
fight body
difficult.
says, says that we'll probably let you through, but we really want this adolescent data if we have any. So if you can give them in silico adolescent data, that just gets you, you know, a half step further.
Yeah, I like that. One piece on that point too that is really important, from my perspective at least, on this topic of limited clinical data. Getting back to the piece we talked about with respect to AI and how AI is all over the place, obviously, and it's being used for clinical trial purposes all over. I think it's important for the community as a whole to appreciate the difference between an AI data set that needs to be trained on large amounts of information from a large, hopefully, cohort of patients. So you're getting a lot of data in, you're training that algorithm on the virtue of or based on a lot of clinical information. That's going to be difficult to then take and extrapolate into some of these more edge case scenarios, because you don't have the training data to get that test or to get that prediction out of the AI piece. The benefit that I always come back to with respect to these modeling simulation techniques, the first principles techniques that we're largely talking about here, is that they have the foundation of including the history that René, you had talked about and alluded to earlier. You know, modeling simulation has been around for decades, right? And we have the ability to model mechanics and physics, and we understand a lot of the laws that largely all of the laws that underscore mechanics. And so, you know, we don't need as much clinical information to train an AI. Instead, we just, you know, the pieces of information we need are more discrete and more limited, and allow us, in my mind, to do prediction on some of these borderline or edge cases more easily using modeling simulation. It's a sort of soapbox of mine with respect to the difference between you know, AI and these first principles techniques. They go together, they interact with each other obviously quite a bit, and they're really important to consider together. But there are many scenarios where I think as a community we may need to make a distinction between the data-based AI tools, machine learning tools, and the more first principles type tools that we're leveraging and talking about a lot here. All right, I want to continue this conversation with respect to regulatory strategy. And this is we talked about the concept of risk a little bit ago on the topic of setting up your strategy and how you go about doing that. One of the things that is, I'd be really curious to hear these thoughts, or your thoughts on this topic is, generally speaking, there needs to be a relationship or a distinction, a consideration of the benefit of a device versus the risk of a device. And that needs to be a very big picture question, right? You have to, however you decide to weigh those things, and this is where the question is going to go, you have to be able to decide, is the benefit likely to outweigh the risk? One of the things that's been coming up more often, that I've seen at least more often, is the concept of quantitative risk benefit analysis. And Bethany, I know you've talked a lot about on this topic, but I don't personally, again, this might be my ignorance, I don't personally understand or know much about how that quantitative assessment is done. And so I'm curious if you can give us a brief overview of that, but really think about, given that modeling and simulation is, if anything, a way to create quantitative information, is there a potential role for modeling and simulation in that quantitative risk-benefit assessment framework, whatever that looks like right now, and how do we look to leverage the quantitative information we can derive in those questions?
Yeah, this is maybe a controversial topic in
Good.
the regulatory community in terms of whether a quantitative benefit risk assessment is needed and if it's even possible.
Okay.
So a little bit of background. There is a particular group at one notified body who has repeatedly asked, and in some cases demanded, not so much anymore, that they be given a quantitative benefit risk ratio for each device. And
Like one number.
I think,
The point is, it's one number that assesses the
yeah.
device. Is that right?
Yes, and it has to
Okay.
have a quantitative acceptance criteria as well.
Okay.
So at Argue Plus, we did put together a methodology. We have a white paper on it. And this was primarily to appease a reviewer at this particular notified body because our client wanted to not push back.
Okay.
They wanted their review to go smoothly. They didn't want to push back. We put together a quantitative benefit risk assessment. It worked. The reviewer was happy. They got their CE marking. Everything worked out well. But there's been a lot of pushback from industry saying this is not something that's needed. We've had a lot of notified body, higher ups at notified bodies saying, you're right, this is not needed. No one should be asking for this.
Okay.
But having said that, there are a lot of quantitative aspects that do go into a benefit risk assessment. I think the FDA has really good guidance documents out there on kind of what elements they want to see in a benefit risk assessment. And they're things like likelihood of occurrence of a benefit happening or a risk happening, the magnitude of a benefit, the severity of a risk, the duration of the benefit or the risk. So, is this going to benefit a person throughout their lifetime? Is the harm, just perioperative and then they kind of recover from it? So these are the things that we want to think about in terms of what we can quantify. Where I think CM&S can start coming into this is this newer concept in benefit risk, which is patient preference. So getting some patient preference information to determine the acceptability of the benefit risk balance, I guess you can say. And let me give you an example of something that, we've seen a client have develop where depending on the patient, the risk can outweigh the benefit or the benefit can outweigh the risk for the exact same device. So this was a device used for anesthetics. So it surface level, so skin level anesthetizing, it basically freezes the skin temporarily and prevents the need for an injection of Novocaine. It freezes the skin temporarily, which means the procedure needs to be done pretty quickly. It's a very superficial procedure. So there's the risk of, if the procedure isn't done quick enough, then the cooling could wear off. So that's a risk. The benefit is that you don't need a needle stick. So you don't need that Novocaine or lidocaine injected. So depending on the patient, you know, if we have a very needle phobic patient, they might not care if, you know, the practitioner needs to do this very quickly. They might just say, I'll do anything to avoid that needle. The benefits clearly outweigh the risks of this device.
Yeah.
And you may have someone else who is very scared of feeling the procedure at all, who says, just give me the anesthetic,
Yeah.
stick it in with a needle, make sure it lasts throughout the entire thing. So this is the kind of patient preference information where it's really difficult to draw a line as to this device definitely, we can say the benefits outweigh the risks or they don't. So maybe we can bring in modeling and simulation and start talking about what types of patients will see a favorable benefit risk outcome, what types of patients will we not see a favorable benefit risk outcome.
Sure. Yeah, interesting.
Not sure if it's going to go there yet, but this is kind of, you know, the brainstorming that's going on in my mind of how this can help with that quantitative benefit risk assessment.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, you know, because certainly we should be able to, with the modeling, you know, differentiate responses. And we might not be able to project exactly what's going to happen, but you know, maybe we'll be able to say something about, yeah, this type of patient is likely to experience this type of benefit, and be able to make the distinction between there. René, any thoughts on that one?
I'm in total support of Bethany. Anyways, I mean, this. I think it might have slipped out of my pen also in the last couple of years with the notified body to ask for actually quantifiable acceptance criteria, specifically in the post-market area, right? Because then it's so closely related to risk management. I mean, of course, also in the pre-market, but I think post-market is even more important what is acceptable when it's on the market. However, Bethany is absolutely right. Like quantifying this is difficult and also needs to be, you know, very well thought through. So yeah, I totally support that path that Bethany was describing. So.
I like it. Yeah, and I think there's the contents or the concept as well of having different profiles of patient preferences and being able to think about, you know, from an overall perspective and recognize, given that description, certainly Bethany, and the difference between one patient who might see some benefits and another who might not derive benefit from or might see risk very differently, can see why we are hesitant to assign, you know, one risk benefit ratio to a device. I can totally appreciate that. On the patient profile perspective, you know, I think having a list of potential preferences or a way to articulate that, and then maybe weighting that based on a distribution of patients or something can help somebody if they do want to have a big picture perspective on things. But yeah, I can see the challenge certainly in doing that. I'm going to kick this over to René here. And I wanted to talk through a little bit about the balance between potential benefits and the risk of including modeling and simulation results, particularly as it relates to notified bodies. You know, I think, as we talked about, there's not as clear of a pathway for socializing the methods you're going to use with a notified body before submitting a particular set of evidence. How can a regulatory professional, how can the modeling folks think about this balancing act between the value that one sees in the evidence versus the potential for a reviewer to look at the same piece of evidence and have a very different perspective on the value of that evidence? If you could let us behind the curtain a little bit in terms of how notified bodies might make a decision in weighing some of this evidence, you know, what goes into that strategy consideration, the strategy risk of including modeling and simulation versus not in a submission?
I think most importantly is actually to decide where to place this strategically. So I think the decision whether to include or not, I don't know if this should be actually the question, because I think we have to push more for computational modeling and simulation data. It doesn't matter if it's for preclinical or if it's actually for clinical. It should be implemented and also submitted. But I think it is important to see where you're going to place this. So actually to make the value clear. So, and this is actually everything, and I think Bethany can agree to this. So whatever is being submitted, you have to tell the story correct. So, and usually it doesn't help if you throw a lot of information at the notified body, and I also would like to advocate here for notified bodies, right? So if they're thrown with all the evidence that you might have, that you think it might be helpful, I think it is great that manufacturers have done a great deal of work. But what is the essence out of this work? So do we really have to submit everything, or is it enough to submit only the valuable part of it? So, right? So I think this is actually what will help also to increase the understanding in regulatory submissions containing computational modeling and simulation data. So if the manufacturer, I mean, and this is also why we are doing this here, I think. So if you say, okay, look at what is really important, I mean, based on the data that you have gotten, and then this is what you can put into your regulatory strategy. If the reviewer does have more questions, yeah, then you have like a huge bunch of evidence still in your drawer, and you can pull it out. Or maybe you can have, I mean, there is potential for dialogue, right? I mean, not like not consulting, as I said earlier, right? I think there's also what we have to respect on both ends. But if there's more question, we can always pull out something more and say, yeah, right, thank you for your question. I mean, we have this evidence also. But I would recommend not to overflow these regulatory submissions with everything you have. I would go for the right story to tell and saying, this is the evidence that we can that we would like to add, and then go with this. And then you will see, I'm very confident. I mean, also seeing in the past, I mean, whatever has been presented to myself, I mean, less is sometimes, it's usually more. So I mean, because if you as a reviewer have to pick, okay, what I'm picking now, I mean, do I have to review everything or just part of it? So if I have to pick as a reviewer, I might pick the wrong thing, right? And this is then the manufacturer who should actually say, okay, this is what I would like you to review. If you have more questions, we can support with more data.
I like it. I like it. Bethany, any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think you brought up a really good point around the story, right? You have to tell the story. By not showing them, it's not that you're hiding data necessarily. You are focusing on answering the questions that the regulators have, right? You're saying, you know, this is the story of my device, what it does, why it helps patients, why it's not going to hurt patients. And I'm going to tell it to you in the most succinct way possible to answer your questions. And I think that's what we want to focus on here. And modeling and simulation is a great tool to use in that storytelling. And it's a great way to be succinct in your storytelling.
And I think the most important thing is nobody else than the manufacturer itself knows the device best. So I mean, it's not the reviewer, right? And it's also the story behind it. So it is actually the manufacturer. I think this is also what we should encourage.
Yeah, and it sounds like from what I'm hearing, you know, it sounds like a scenario where you tell a concise story, a clear story. You address what you believe to be the biggest issues. If there are pieces of that story that require additional elaboration, additional information, the reviewer, the notified body, is going to go out and they're going to say, hey, we need some more information about this. How did you come up with this? And so from that perspective, we want to be concise with respect to the way we package the credibility evidence and the modeling results and all of that. We want to put that all together. We want to make sure it fits in the story. We want to make sure we have the right things in our back pocket to be able to pull off the shelf or whatever the analogy is to answer those questions. But we'll leave it up to the notified body to ask those questions of us.
Absolutely. And if I might add this, looking into the Article 61 of the MDR, I read that the first paragraph actually allows the manufacturer to add. I mean, this is the clinical part of the MDR, allows the manufacturer actually to provide the data that they think is sufficient to demonstrate safety and performance and the benefit of the device. Of course, if there are standards that you have to fulfill, that's no question, right? That needs to be fulfilled. However, every device might be different. So, and again, it's the manufacturer who knows best what should be selected to support safety benefit and the safety benefit and the performance. So
are there timeline risks to that approach? Because I can imagine, and maybe this is a naive thought here, but I can imagine a scenario where you wouldn't want to risk the delay associated with getting asked for more information, needing to compile that information, submitting that information, and then having that information reviewed. And so there might be a tendency to want to put a more comprehensive piece of the story or discussion into the original submission. Is that a concern with respect to timeline?
In my experience, you're always going to get asked questions.
Okay. Yeah, so you're going to get questions anyway. So there's not necessarily, you're not going to get ahead of it, and you're not going to like fully satisfy somebody. Okay.
Yeah, and in the same breath, you know, if you give too much, that's more for them to ask questions on.
Right.
But not only more to ask questions, but I mean also potentially adding more confusion, right? So I think, I mean, you talked about acceptance criteria. If you submit 5 or 6 or 7 pages of acceptance criteria that you found somewhere, I mean, this is not leading anywhere. I mean, even if it might look great that you have that many pages, but I mean, this is not going to help in the end to demonstrate that the device is compliant with the regulation.
Yeah, I like that. And, you know, I think that really goes back to something we obviously talked about very early in this discussion, just the value of being concise, the value of being clear, the value of making sure that we have whatever piece of information we need in a transparent fashion presented to the decision-making folks there. And I think that's a particular challenge with probably with every source of evidence, but I can feel it acutely with respect to modeling and simulation, because being concise with these things can be very challenging and difficult. So yeah, maybe a challenge for the audience from the technical perspective there to really keep things locked down. Awesome. On that somewhat similar vein, I'm going to go to Bethany with this next question. And maybe our prior discussion actually answered it, but with respect to validation approaches and gathering credibility evidence for modeling and simulation, we often have a need to establish the failure modes and failure criteria associated with a particular aspect of our model. So just as a classic example, like if you're testing a paperclip, not that never a medical device, obviously, but if you're testing a paperclip, you know, it might be a question
on
of
the intended purpose.
Yeah, right. And the risks and everything. Yeah. You know, you might be talking about how many times do you bend it back and forth for it to fail. And then the question might be, you know, can the model accurately predict that? And so inherent to many approaches with our validation, we need to find the edges of performance. Are there any concerns with respect to, from a validation and credibility perspective, including evidence that, or testing or whatever, that speaks to potential failure modes or issues associated with the device? We want to be transparent, we want to be clear, we want to be ethical with respect to how we talk about this. But how should we weigh, or are there any concerns, and maybe there's not, with respect to including evidence that might speak to the weaknesses of a product in service of, you know, supporting some kind of modeling and simulation?
And going back to the article that René just pointed out, Article 61 in the MDR, specifically says include all favorable and unfavorable evidence.
Yeah. Okay.
So this is where you get back to telling your story. You know, if you do have data on these failure modes because you've pushed it and pushed it and pushed it to the point of breakage, that's goes into your story, right? Like, we can say this is highly, highly unlikely to ever happen in clinical practice. but we know what happens, you know, if we do get to that point. We know what that point is. We can understand the circumstances that would lead to that point. I think that just strengthens your submission and your argument.
Okay. René, anything to add on that?
Yeah, I think Bethany, you're right. On the other hand, I think we really have to focus. I mean, I'm just saying this because I also saw this in submissions, and sometimes I talk about this with manufacturers. Do we really have to test until it breaks? I mean, you said this before, right? I mean, it has to fit into the intended purpose. And I think this is also the same. I mean, this is the same for In-Silico data. Do we really have to go all the way into every corner that might not be at all in the intended purpose anymore? So I think, I mean, also thinking about the effort, because I mean, it also takes a lot of time and money to simulate all of this. So
yeah,
I think it also should be handled with a good sense of, you know, what can really happen in clinical practice. And of course, I think you can destroy everything, every medical device by just not treating it right. But I think if you treat it right in the defined framework, in the instructions for use, and I mean, if in the trainings that has been provided, I don't know. I mean, we can't see everything that is actually unforeseeable. So,
yeah, no, thank you. I appreciate that perspective.
Again, I mean, also from an economical standpoint, and also from a standpoint, I mean, we talked about this earlier, what is the timing for getting on the market? But I mean, if you have to really test for everything that is very unlikely to happen, then you might not get on the market, and it won't help the user, it won't help the patient.
Yeah, and that's, you know, probably a significant use case for modeling simulation in terms of being able to, you know, check off the boxes on how some of these things might fail. And Bethany, to one of the phrases that you used just a moment ago, being able to establish just how far away your typical operation is from whatever those edges might be, and, you know, just sort of predicting on the strength of the to the physics-based modeling and just our knowledge of material performance and things that you may have or hopefully have for your product. I do want to switch gears here to our third topic. And before we get into this is going to be on clinical development and protocol design and those sorts of things, which is obviously relevant from an in-silico clinical trial perspective. So we'll get some thoughts, hopefully, from René and Bethany on this one. But before we get into that question, I do want to make sure anybody who's listening to this who has a question that they want to ask, we'll have some time at the end. Do feel free to include those questions in the chat panel or a Q&A or wherever the mechanism is here on Zoom for getting those questions in. But now would be a good time to put those questions in if you have them. So René, we'll go to you first on this clinical question. And this is big, very big picture. So as we think about including in-silico clinical trial evidence in support of clinical trials, maybe it helps to design clinical trials, maybe it helps to provide evidence that is assessed in parallel with clinical evidence. Just curious on the typical timeline for the design of a clinical trial protocol. What I'm wondering is, you know, when are these decisions made? When is it important for somebody who's running modeling simulation tools, who has some of this evidence, who thinks they might be able to contribute to this process? How should they be thinking about the question of when to be discussing this evidence, when they need to have their methods set, these sorts of things? Like what's the timeline really just on the protocol design side of things?
I think the most important thing is, and I think that's also what Bethany said earlier when we started discussing about the medical device, it's actually the intended purpose. So what is actually the device being made for? What should it be used for? And yeah, what is the patient population? Because based on this, I think you have to make clear, I mean, if it is a mainstream device, do we have, and what we also said earlier, do we have enough patients to enroll to meet first endpoint, primary endpoint, secondary endpoints of the clinical study? Is there anything that we need to know in particular? So, and I said earlier also that maybe we don't have any patients, right? So this is maybe this is a very rare indication or a very rare patient population. So we won't have enough patients at all. I mean, we might have a little part of it, but the rest of it we won't get together within a good timeline, because you can't run a trial forever. So this is unethical also for the patients. The other question is it risky procedure? So is there anything that we can actually do in advance and before I mean, this is something that you could see when you plan the clinical trial. So what is something that you have to take into account? Complication rates. I mean, and also something like, is there a potential that we actually have to stop the trial because we might have, or we might run into complications that are foreseeable? So I think this is something that needs to be very clear in advance. I think a good point here is actually to search the state of the art. I mean, do a literature search, have a very well founded background for the state of the art, for the trials, for the patient populations that you were actually treating. What is the follow-up that you actually need? I mean, is this something that you can also do? I mean, with your clinical trial, or do you? I mean, you have to go into PMCF study maybe anyways, but will this answer your question? So, I think time-wise, I think these are the things that needs to be considered before you start thinking about, okay, now going into MDR, then going into Article 62, how to write the clinical study protocol. I think these are the things that needs to be done before that. So, and then because if you're in the process of writing the protocol, making deviations is very difficult. So once it's approved, once it's up and running, so I think this is something that needs to be planned in advance. And I think one very important thing is to talk to people who actually did clinical trials in this area, and look into publications of randomized control trials, peer-reviewed trials, to have a good basis actually for the planning.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Bethany, anything to add onto that one?
I think Renee hit the high points. I just want to reinforce that, focus on what the state of the art is. So if your device was not on the market, what else would clinicians be using for it? And that's kind of how the EU defines the state of the art in medicine. And you want to make sure that you understand that, and that you're sort of designing your clinical trial to focus on your device as a replacement or as another option to the state of the art.
Got it. Got it. Okay. Sounds good. Sounds good. This may actually be our last question here before we get into some that have come in through the audience. But I did want to touch on a question that I have, and I think is inherent to the use of modeling simulation for in silico clinical trials. And it's this idea of partial clinical evidence. And I'll define it this way. So in a typical clinical trial, for every patient, you're going to have the full spectrum of results. There's probably a number of different endpoints or a number of different things that are going to be assessed for a given patient in the trial, but you're going to look at all of them for each patient. So it's going to include health outcomes. It's going to include things like immediately after a procedure, are you able to, in the context of a heart valve, for instance, what are the hemodynamics right after the device is implanted, all the way out to, has the patient been re-hospitalized over 12 months, or is the patient still alive? So you have all of that evidence, different types of evidence for each patient. Contrast that to a scenario like in silico clinical trials, where it might be very good, the modeling setup that you have might be very good at predicting specific aspects of the clinical trial results. So for instance, going back to that heart valve example, it might be able to predict for a certain virtual patient what the hemodynamics are for that patient. But you might not be able to get information on some of the other endpoints. And so as we think about partial evidence, and as we think about the fact that you may not be able to, with your modeling simulation framework, be able to assess every clinical question, are there any concerns or considerations for deciding whether that partial evidence is going to tell enough of the story, or are there concerns with respect to having a framework that only gives you some of the story?
I'm going to flip your question a little bit.
Great.
And
Please.
instead of
Yeah.
talking about the concerns, I'm going to talk about the opportunities.
Great. I love it. Yeah.
With which we need maybe just one outcome, right? Or
Okay.
one piece of clinical evidence.
Mm-hmm.
So this, I think, is a perfect fit for post-market clinical follow-up. So if you, and this is primarily focused on EU submissions, you know, if you have your submission, your initial submission, and you've got, you know, a lot of data on maybe one subpopulation, some data on your other subpopulation, but there are a couple of endpoints maybe that you're not finding evidence for, maybe something went wrong with your clinical trial and you lost some of that evidence. And I'm going to focus on an example in a minute. But there are just a couple of outcomes that maybe you want to focus on that you need to supplement your data set with. I think this is a perfect example for when you can bring in that focused modeling and simulation information into it, your in-silico clinical trial. So this is my favorite example because I think it's the most advanced that I've seen a regulator accept in terms of in-silico clinical trials. And this is a case where we were working with a manufacturer who had a device that I'm going to try to kind of preserve their anonymity a little bit here. And I'll say they had an accessory to an organ transplant. So their device was intended to prolong the life of someone who had an organ transplant.
Mm-hmm.
And they had, you know, maybe 150 patients in their first cohort, their first clinical trial. They got really good results on it. They had a post-market clinical follow-up study planned for 500 patients. They got data on those 500 patients, but something within the hospital procedures, which was out of their control, after they gathered data on those 500 patients, it came to light that there was something going on with the hospital procedure, and they could not use any of the data from those 500 patients. But they had already been CE marked. Notified body was kind of banking on them having 500 more patients with a long-term follow-up. So that's another point that I want to make. Their initial study, they had a 1-year follow-up. Their post-market clinical follow-up study, they were planning on a 5-year follow-up, and that's what the notified body wanted to see. That was 5 years. So what they did was do something that I think a lot of people are uncomfortable with right now, but we may start seeing it more and more. They used probabilistic methods. So there is a medical device on the market that is an AI-based software medical device that takes, you know, certain physiological parameters at the time of organ implantation and 1 year after organ implantation, and it predicts the patient's survival out to 5 years and 10 years. So that medical device is its intended purpose is to predict the survival of the organ to 5 years and 10 years. So this organ transplant accessory, they talked to their notified body, they had a dialogue with them, they said, listen, we don't have actual patient data for 5 years, but we have patient data for 1 year, and we know that we can use this AI-based medical device that you, particular notified body, has approved to get some of that data, predict some of that data out to 5 and 10 years. And the notified body agreed for them to use it.
Nice.
So
nice,
I think that's a great example of, you know, they were only getting one outcome out of it. They were getting survivability of the organ, but that's the one that they needed in their post-market clinical follow-up.
So it sounds like we shouldn't be shy about including evidence that only speaks to some of the story with respect to the endpoints. If we can do that, because I know one of the big hangups is, whether or not our modeling simulation tools can predict, going back to card, things like, 2-year outcomes with respect to health outcomes of, whether a patient is dead or not, or has passed away. And, those things are very difficult to predict from a simulation of a heart valve implantation, right? But we can get some other piece of information much more easily and with much more confidence. And so what I'm hearing you say, and I appreciate the story of, just really wanting to focus on what piece of the story can you tell with the modeling and simulation. I think that probably comes back to the broader theme of telling the story, getting the pieces together, making sure that the modeling and simulation evidence is part of that story where it's necessary, but having a rationale for why you're including it, having that as a piece of the transparent story that you're trying to communicate to the regulators. I like it.
And maybe it's one piece of evidence that is difficult to get in actual clinical practice. So if we can maybe cut that out of our actual clinical study and use in-silico methods instead, that's the one endpoint that you can justify using in-silico clinical methods.
Yeah, I like that actually, because what immediately came to mind is cost savings. If there's a particular method that you can potentially, with some really sophisticated imaging tools or some other type of assessment, get a piece of information in the clinic, but it is tremendously expensive or difficult to get for whatever reason, but you can get a pretty good analog of that with modeling and simulation. And maybe you cut that out, the expensive piece out of your protocol, and instead do modeling and simulation, which, some folks might laugh if I categorize modeling and simulation as cheaper than something else, but in some cases it very well may be. René, anything to add on to that?
Yeah, I think it's not only the cost, but I think it's also the patient itself, right? I think every day you can spare the patient of being enrolled in a study. I think this is also quality of life.
Yeah.
And also coming back to Bethany's example, I think even if you do everything right, use the device in the right way. But I mean, if the patient in the end can't comply with, everything, I mean, also, and then if something happens with the transplant, I mean, it's not because the device failed, right? So I think using modeling and simulation, I mean, you can actually focus on the important parts. I mean, patient and non-compliance of patients. I mean, this is something that we have to take into account, but I think this is not the fault of the device itself.
Right.
And I think this is why I think the example is great, Bethany. Thank you for sharing.
Beautiful. All right, that's great. So I think at this point, I've exhausted my little list of questions here. I'm going to ask Bethany and René if there's anything else that they want to mention before we bring Alex back in and we start answering asking some more general questions that don't fit into or weren't on my original list. So Bethany, I'll ask you first, and then René, if there's anything you want to add. Anything to add that we didn't touch on that you think is important particularly for people from a technical perspective who would love to include more of their modeling and simulation in a regulatory context?
I just want to reiterate, have those conversations, keep the dialogue open internally at your company, externally, whenever you go to meetings with regulators. I just want everyone to be talking about this because that's how it's going to gain momentum.
I'm going to actually steal that point real quick. We mentioned RAPS. Any other conferences or places to go to intermingle with the regulatory folks that would be a good venue for discussing these things and growing? Obviously, internally, we want to water cooler it up and do that kind of thing. But from a conference perspective or other sorts of venues, anything that comes to mind that goes beyond the RAPS conferences?
I think we want to focus on therapeutic specific areas have their own conferences. So like in the cardiac space, there are a number of cardiac conferences that I think would be open to this type of conversation.
Yeah. Great. Awesome. Thank you. René, anything big picture that you'd like to add that we haven't talked about yet?
No, I think it is great that we actually speak about this, that this is going to be more transparent. I really appreciate you moderating this session. I really appreciate that Alex is actually putting this together and leading this UK CEiRSI. I mean, this is really a great work, and it's a pleasure to talk to Bethany. And I think we need more of this exchange. I mean, I see myself also more in the role of a facilitator. I mean, I've never done an own modeling myself, but I think it is important to bring the people together and speak one language.
Yeah, totally agree. And we've got the man in the screen here, as you can see, who brought this all together. And I do think I agree. One of the biggest things I'm excited about with respect to the CEiRSI is the fact that we do have these groups together. I love talking to modeling and simulation people, but we can be kind of boring and we talk about the same things over and over. So it's nice to talk about other things with other folks. So I appreciate you guys joining. Appreciate Alex for facilitating all of this. And without further ado, Alex, anything you want to ask our panelists?
So maybe one comment and then maybe a question. Some of you were referring to the need to link with some of the regulatory affairs conferences, and I want to point out there will be a special session on in-silico methods in EuroRapt in Brussels in a few weeks from now. And this came from a group of people from both Avicii Alliance and the CEiRSI, precisely with the intention of reaching out. And I would say that, well, sometimes it seems as if there is a pushback from regulators regarding in-silico methods. I found both in FDA and in MHRA in the UK extremely open to understand and listen. Of course, they want to put the right guardrails around what is submitted, but I don't see so much of a challenge there. What I've seen is a lot of colleagues from industry actually saying that they find some difficulties in their own regulatory affairs groups, partly because there is a certain sense that if you go with the old and known approach, you sort of tend to be less able to attract that delays. And also in that regards, that there is a lot of interest in that there is less concern about the cost savings as much as the potential to reduce timelines from the use of modeling and simulation. So perhaps as modelers, we need to be looking at how we can provide extra reassurances to that effect. Now,
yeah, Alex, if I can interrupt you real quick, sorry. I wanted to touch on something that you just mentioned with respect to risk and hesitancy to do different things. I was curious if Bethany or René, do you guys have any thoughts on how things may or may not have changed at the FDA? Well, they certainly have changed, but how we should be thinking about modeling and simulation given the changes at the FDA with the current administration, without touching on that specifically, but there's certainly a lot of upheaval, no question about that. Do you think, and maybe this is a bit more of an opinion piece to put you on the spot, do you think that there is going to be more hesitancy to use modeling simulation because it might represent a new method, or more value to using it because it might help you to de-risk or get through processes quickly, or some other aspect of this process that actually could incentivize using modeling simulation? Bethany, I'll ask you first. Do you see any changes, or can you imagine any scenario? And I recognize it's a US-centric question, but I think it does touch on the whole industry.
That's a great question. I think what the general opinion coming out of all of the changes, based on what we assume is going to be reduced resources in terms of reviewers and specialists in reviewing, are more questions coming out of the FDA. So not necessarily reviewers not meeting their timelines, but reviewers not being able to do a thorough review within the timeline, so there will be more questions. So I guess my opinion and my advice is to make sure that you're being very clear and documenting and justifying your methods for using things. I don't necessarily think it'll be any better or worse to use new methods, as long as you're able to justify them and instill confidence in your reviewer that it's the right thing to do.
Yeah, and I think that could be an opportunity for modeling simulation in the sense that if if it helps to answer questions, if it puts you in a better position to be more agile with respect to answering why this particular animal model might be more attractive or more applicable or whatever, there could be a place there for looking at modeling simulation as an opportunity. All right, didn't want to, sorry, Alex, for cutting you off there, but I did want to make sure we got some thoughts on that. So back to you, Alex. Oh, muted.
Yeah, maybe my question to the panel is, sometimes I understood that some of the people who need to adopt these tools are also looking into the impacts on liabilities if, you know, something goes wrong and part of your evidence that led to that product was built on in silico evidence. I would like to know if you could comment, if you do have expertise in terms of, are there specific standards that, you know, I think they're called regulatory standards, those that if you satisfy them, effectively you're satisfying regulations that are particularly relevant for modeling and simulation, in the sense that they provide some sort of legal cover for doing that? Or put it differently, if you satisfy the current standards with additional evidence through modeling and simulation, does it provide an extra you know, burden of proof that you have actually gone the extra mile, or it pretty much leaves you in the same place that if you haven't done it? Is there any incentive that we could sort of elaborate when talking to industry about why this is a good idea?
Would you like to go first? Or mean,
You can go ahead.
So I'm actually, Alex, I think that's a great question. I think there's not I mean, not to my knowledge, there's no paperwork that actually tells anything about that in any ways, unfortunately, yet. So I think this is something that that's something that we need to work on for sure. Regarding liability, I've seen, I mean, from the perspective of a reviewer, I've seen quite a lot of study protocols, human clinical trial study protocols. And I think there was not one that was without any flaws, right? Because that happens, right? And you can't predict the data. I mean, also not from the beginning when you put the clinical investigation plan together. And I mean, you can't predict this, right? So you might end up after a couple of years with a lot of issues and not enough evidence. So I think this is something where we should definitely advocate. I mean, talking about liability, I think nobody can give you the guarantee that if you do a clinical trial that your results will actually be substantiated, because there can always be liability issues with the data that you're generating. So I think this is the same aspect we should actually put onto in silico clinical trials. But there's the difference that in advance, it is possible to decrease the risk of liability issues as far as possible, that you cannot do with a human clinical trial, because you don't know what is happening down the line with the patients, with their dropout rates, with maybe also changing in standards in treating state of the art. I mean, we don't know this, right? So this is something what in silico actually, the potential that in silico actually has, that you can, you know, build, or that you can actually reduce liability issues as far as possible.
Very nice.
Yeah,
Bethany?
and in terms of you know, providing supplemental information from in silico trials, that's maybe in addition to what you actually need. I think that a lot of manufacturers, just from a business perspective, are not going to want to repeat that kind of validation. But at the same time, it can provide value in terms of instilling more confidence. So it can be kind of a bridging mechanism, I guess, if you're able to invest that kind of effort into it. You know, if you have your in clinical, or if you have your modeling and simulation and you have your bench testing and they're showing the same thing, or maybe your modeling and simulation is able to give you a little more details on it. then that can be evidence that you're validating your method, or at least for that particular case, the method is validated. So in the future, we can focus solely on the modeling and simulation and call the bench testing superfluous, maybe.
I like that.
And then also, sorry, and maybe also speaking about liability risk. I mean, if you have like a new heart valve developed, right, one of these transcatheter heart valves, I mean, there is maybe the risk of that struts are actually poking into the myocardium, you know, leading to dissections and like really harm to the heart. I mean, this is something that you don't want. I mean, you can't see. You might see this in an animal model, but you will not be able, or you don't want to see this in a human trial. So I mean, these are things that you would like to know in advance, and I think this is where in silico modeling can actually, or in silico clinical trials can really help, also with regard to liability issues that you will not encounter then if you actually do a clinical trial with humans.
So like de-risking your clinical trial before
Absolutely.
you actually start
Absolutely.
a clinical trial. Yeah.
Yeah, I like that. Yes, Alex, let's address that question. So I see somebody ask a question, and this goes back to this point about partial evidence and selecting particular endpoints and using modeling simulation for pieces of the puzzle as it relates to the endpoints. The question is related to using data from modeling simulation in selective cases to support endpoints. And the point is that it seems like this is cherry picking, or could be perceived that way. Are there thoughts on regulatory agencies accepting data from the perspective of whether or not that data is cherry picking, or that there is some question around, well, why did you include that endpoint for modeling and simulation and you didn't address this other one, or anything related to this perception of cherry picking?
That's an interesting question. I hope that something like this is not seen as cherry picking if you can provide a sound justification. And this, you know, goes back to our theme over and over again of telling the story. So if you can tell an adequate enough story as to why computer modeling and simulation is the best method for that particular outcome, why it's difficult to get it clinically, why it's maybe unreliable when we try to get it clinically, then that can, you know, go a long way to your justification and the regulator's acceptance of it.
I like that.
And on the in addition to that, even with the, I mean, comparing to a regular clinical trial, I mean, there's also the possibility to do cherry picking. I mean, there's also the possibility to do specific sub-analyses, and I mean, saying that you actually reach your endpoints earlier, or so I think this is also possible in right now, nowadays, right?
Yeah.
So I think this is always something that has to be taken into account.
So it may not be a unique consideration necessarily for modeling and simulation. It may be something that, or it sounds like it is a consideration for any piece of evidence that you're including. And Bethany, to your point, you have to justify why are you looking at that, and maybe there's, you know, a published reason in terms of these are the endpoints one should look at. Maybe there's predicate information, or maybe it just is assessing or addressing a piece of the bigger clinical question, regulatory question that a device has. Sounds good. Alex, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, regarding this question, the other thing I think we need to perhaps start doing more, or we will start doing more as this becomes more mainstream, is do very much what we do in regular trials, precisely to avoid the cherry picking, which is we do need to publish the protocols of analysis ahead of the starting the study. Maybe the protocol would be of the type that, you know, every single complication that is observed in the human arm will be explored with a particular set of methods, so that you provide certain reassurances that what you have done it in every circumstance, not in a cherry picking manner, right? And I would agree with some of the comments you and others made that there are some of these issues which are not specific to In-Silico, but are specific to good research or bad research, or good scientific evidence, bad scientific evidence.
yeah, and I think having something like clinicaltrials.gov, where we publish protocols ahead of the starting point and have, a particular in silico protocol well annexed to a regular trial will be a way around that, I think.
Yeah, and I think, Alex, I love that point, and I'll echo it or mirror it on the back end as well. One of the things that's most interesting in this space for me is the idea of where do the modeling results show up. They certainly need to be put together in concert with the other evidence that you have in a submission package. But I want to make sure that as a community, we're thinking about the fact that we should be publishing and exposing whatever the results are to other or not other, because I'm not a clinician, but to clinician responses and clinician viewpoints. Because one of my favorite parts of conferences are the panels that come after the presentation of clinical results, when there's all this discussion from clinicians of, did you think about this? Or, what about the, XYZ conversation, trying to not only, obviously there's the peer review portion of publications, but really live peer review in conferences and in other settings. And I think we need to prepare results and put our modeling and simulation results in that same framework where other modelers have an opportunity perhaps to ask questions about things, but certainly clinicians have an opportunity to see what the results are, see what the methods are, ask questions about it. And I think there's a huge educational piece there to get to that point. But if we're really, my personal opinion is, if we're really going to include in silico clinical trial results in actual packages and so forth, it should be treated on par with the way other evidence is assessed, other clinical data. Awesome. All right. Well, my clock at least is saying that we're out of time. So I appreciate René, Bethany. Thank you guys for coming out. Thanks everybody for joining us who's on the line here. As mentioned, this will be recorded, so do send it out to friends and family, colleagues, and so forth. And feel free to reach out to any of us with any questions or follow-up that you may have.